Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This session is plenary session number 3 with the title of New Roles of Universities in Creative Economy as a Center for Knowledge Creation and Integration. I am Yoon Kim from KAIST, and our president, Steve Kang, is supposed to be here, but he had to go to England, so he couldn't be here. As discussed in the previous session, university's role has become beyond the traditional academic activities and became the center for economic development based on creation and application of knowledge. These days, Korea talks a lot about creative economy for the country's next leap. My university, KAIST, is also trying to lead this activity. And in this session, we have 3 prominent speakers who are the leaders of world-leading universities to discuss their experiences of innovation. And the 3 speakers are Chancellor Pradeep Khosla from University of California, San Diego, and Director Regis Kelly of California Institute of Quantitative Bioscience, which is QB3. And third speaker is Professor Gerhard Schmidt, who's Senior Vice President of ETH Global in Switzerland. So I will, each speakers will have 20 minutes to speak, and at the end we're going to have a little bit of a discussion between the speakers and the audience on the floor. So without spending too much time, let's start the first talk.
Thank you, Professor Kim, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pradeep Khosla, and I'm going to talk about the role of the research university in economic development. You know, it's easy to talk about it nowadays. We just take it for granted, but it was not until World War II that somebody realized that the universities had a big role in economic developments. Let's see, how does this go? Okay. All right. So, World War II is an important milestone. It's an important time for multiple reasons. Going up to World War II, the US invested a lot in research and development, but mainly to win the war. That was the whole idea of research up to World War II. When World War II ended, when Ever Bush, who was the science advisor for President Roosevelt, basically, the president asked him, what is it that we should be doing now that we have created this infrastructure in universities of a lot of research? And the conclusion at that time was that we should use this infrastructure for the benefit of mankind, and we should fund research at universities so that we basically advance science to ensure health and prosperity. And the government should invest in university research, and then the government should provide scholarships and fellowships to develop scientific talent. Now, this is an important report. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. So if you've not had a chance to read this report, go up on the website. Science, the Endless Frontier is a very important report written in 1945. It is very visionary, and it basically describes the way we see universities today. Between World War II, from 1945 to about 2000, the US generated more wealth than was ever generated by any civilization in that 60-year period ever in the history of mankind. We have not seen that much amount of wealth being generated by any country, any time. Not only there was wealth generation, but every generation lived better than the generation before that. Not only that, but because of the wealth created, a whole lot of economies across the whole world were impacted. So if you look at the Asian economies right now, a lot of the impact was because of the investment in research and development in the US, and then the wealth generated by the US. If you look at the history of, and the economic development in U.S. has been tied very closely to investments in basic research. So this graph shows you the investment in basic research in the U.S. from like 1900 onwards. Actually, it's 1953 to 2013. And you can see that the investment is about $140 billion a year, which is a large part of our GDP. So, what has happened with research universities? So, in this 65, 70-year period, universities which were basically meant to educate students at some point became not only, their goal was not only to educate students, but they became creators of knowledge, Not only became creators of knowledge, but they became agents of change. So, there are a lot of cities now in the US where the mayors of cities think in terms of education being a key driver for economic development. So for example, if you look at Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, you cannot imagine Silicon Valley without Stanford, without UC Berkeley, and actually now in the biotech area without UC San Francisco. If you think about Boston, you cannot imagine Boston without MIT, without Harvard, without Northeastern, without Boston University. If you think about San Diego, you cannot imagine San Diego without UC San Diego. And the reason you cannot imagine a city without the university is because the university is one of the main drivers of economic development in a city. Part of the job, it's not the job of a university, but it has become the mission of a university is to create not only economic development, but create new businesses and jobs. Universities become the hub for attracting talent and resources, and they also unite research, education, and service in ways that did not happen in the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, here's an example of the power of universities in the US. If you think about a company like Google, Google was a PhD thesis of two PhD students, funded totally by the US government. When the PhD thesis was done, these students go out, get venture capital money from outside, create a company, and it is worth $350 billion today. There is no country in the world that has an example of a Google. Exactly, government-funded research, supporting PhD work, being commercialized to create a large market cap, to create large amount of wealth, and create large number of jobs. And in the US, there are many, many examples of situations like this. And there is hardly an example of situation like this in the rest of the world. So it's not a surprise to me that the rest of the world wants to figure out what is it that's good about the US. And I think hopefully in the panel discussion we can talk about what's good about the US. It's partly the culture, where we have an egalitarian culture. Everybody's allowed to challenge everybody else. The universities are totally based on excellence, totally bottom up. There is no top-down hierarchy in a university. As chancellor, if I tell a professor to do something, he or she will just walk away and do whatever he or she wants. They don't listen to me, right? But my job is not for them to listen to me. My job is to create an environment where they really excel at what they do. And then my job is then to work with the city and the mayor and the county to make sure that what we are doing in the university is being transitioned out in a seamless manner. So we take that very seriously. So if you look at the American universities in in the year 2010, just 3 years ago, there were 657 new products created purely at universities. About 4,300 patents were issued, and about 20,000 patent disclosures only from universities. And this is actually a very big number, given that it's all federally funded research. These universities received about $2.4 billion of income in fiscal 2010. Now, this is actually a little bit of a red herring, so it looks like a big number, but the return, the royalty income that a university gets on the average in the US is about 2% of the federal funding that is invested in the university. So it's not a very high return. The high return is more in terms of students going out, starting companies, creating entrepreneurial activity, creating jobs, and then creating wealth after that. So as chancellor, I'm not a very strong supporter or a believer in controlling licenses to create royalty income, because I think it's a very small amount of money. I think we should reduce the friction between creation of knowledge and transition of knowledge. We should make that friction zero, basically. And here's what the role of the university looks like in the California system, where in the middle is the UC system, say UC San Diego. So we get funding from the US government, we get funding from foundations, we get funding from the state of California. And our job is to educate students, undergraduate students, to educate research students, PhD and postdocs, and then to create knowledge in that process, and then transition that knowledge for economic growth and wealth and jobs. So UC San Diego, for example, has $250 million it gets from the state, has a $3.7 billion budget, so it only has 6% of its funding from the state. It has a $1 billion research portfolio. This is a very high number. So this, the UC San Diego is ranked number 6th in the US in terms of federally funded research. And with this $1 billion research portfolio, we basically invest in training postdocs, doing research, training PhD students, and then transitioning the technology. And last year, we reported more than 400 patents with this $1 billion portfolio. With 2,600 active innovations and more than 1,600 patents, and the total intellectual property income in 2011 was about $19 million. So you can see this number, right? $20 million of intellectual property on a $1 billion research portfolio is only about 2%. So that's not the return on investment. The return on investment really is in creating companies and sending these companies outside. So in the last 40 years, UC San Diego has created about 650 companies in the local area. So there's something very special about San Diego that I want to mention. San Diego, one of our key strengths in San Diego as a city is collaboration. And let me just give you one example of this. So San Diego is one of the top biotech clusters in the country. San Francisco, Boston, and San Diego would be the 3 top biotech clusters in the country. So if you look at San Diego, in a very small area, less than 2-mile radius area, we have some of the best biotech research institutes in the country. And these research institutes not only compete with each other in terms of getting federal dollars, but once they get the funding, they all collaborate. So for example, Salk Institute, which is Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. Salk Institute researchers are faculty members at UC San Diego. Even though they are 2 separate institutions, we give them a faculty position at UC San Diego so that they can have access to PhD students, as they don't have the authority to give PhDs in their organization. So there are many, many such examples of collaboration, and that's the other thing that I think as you think about the role of a university in a city, it's not just about universities creating technologies and transferring technologies. It's also then multiple universities, multiple research organizations collaborating with each other, and then being supported by policies and infrastructure, both from the federal government and down to the city level. So here's what San Diego looks like. So if you look at the history of San Diego in about 20 years, from 1991 to 2010, from a military town and a tourist town, it became a biotech cluster, infotech cluster, and a clean tech cluster. And this is the type of transformations that most cities in the world are unable to go through. And this is the type of transformation that requires very enlightened leadership in the city, in the county, and also in the state. And I think in California, we've been blessed with very enlightened leadership most of the time, not all the time. Sometimes we don't have that good leadership. So right now, the country does not have good leadership. So what has happened here is you can see that in biotech, we have nearly doubled the number of jobs. In infotech, about 60% increase in the number of jobs. And in clean tech, also double the number of jobs, right? So we are reducing our, how much dependent we are on military and on tourism, and we are focusing mainly on high tech. So let me just summarize what has happened in San Diego. There has been a significant growth in basic research institutions, and because of this significant growth, you can see that the biotech cluster I showed you was created mainly because of growth in biotech research institutions in the city. There is a regional ability to attract research and development dollars, and UC San Diego being the leader, where we attract about $1 billion a year. 2 new industry clusters that have been created, biotech, all in the last 20 years, and wireless also in the last maybe 25 years or so. And the workforce training infrastructure, that's an important part. So universities train bachelor's, master's, and PhD. But once you have companies that are created, you need like extension type of infrastructure where continuing education, where these people need education courses on a daily basis. So that's the other important thing that universities have, a role that the universities have to play. And let me talk about San Diego and our international partnerships. So right now, innovation, I think, is not limited. Even though I'm from San Diego, I say it's limited to San Diego. But the fact is it's not. I think we should be now looking at global innovation, collaborative innovation across countries, within country, across states. And in that context, we are trying to build relationships with multiple universities across the world, especially in South America and Latin America, because that's a cluster that is right now underserved. And we have several, what did I do out here? I don't know what I'm doing, but anyway, point I'm trying to make is we are reaching out to just about everybody and trying to build these collaborations, because I think that's the way of the future and that's the way we want to go. So thank you very much for listening. Did I finish in time? Oh, good.
No, you're doing very well. Thank you. We're going to ask questions when you have questions at the end of the session. Then we're going to move to the next speaker, Professor Regis Kelly, talking about evolving roles of universities.
I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this marvelous meeting and for the hospitality you've shown me since I've been here. So I'm going to talk about the evolving roles of universities in knowledge creation. As a biologist, I really like to emphasize the fact that universities are evolving very worldwide. And why that's important, for those of you who remember your biology from high school, the rate of evolution varies enormously between species. Like if you were to go back 200 years in time and you saw a frog, you would immediately recognize the frog, because frogs haven't changed in 200 million years. But in the same time, humans and songbirds have evolved very rapidly. So the rate of evolution of species is not constant, and neither has been the rate of evolution of universities. So if universities want to evolve fast, they've got to do what humans and songbirds do. They can't be like frogs. They've got to have accelerators for evolution. So what I want to talk about this morning are just two examples of what we consider are ways in which universities can accelerate the way that they evolve. And by the way, since evolution involves making mistakes and having to correct the mistakes, I'm going to try and refer to a couple of things we've done which were wrong, which didn't work, because that's how biology goes. So let's start. What we would all like to do, of course, is solve society's problems, and I've listed just a few of them up on the screen there. The key point is all of these problems are defined in innovation literature as wicked problems. Now, a wicked problem is described as one of those which you've got to get people to solve it. You've got to bring people together from different disciplines who don't normally work together. So these are really major, major issues. So now, academia would be, in fact, you would think, an ideal place to solve wicked problems, because in academia we have departments of just about everything. So we should be able to put people together to solve wicked problems. The trouble is that in universities, currently, we almost exclusively support specialization by our faculty. So everyone is encouraged to become increasingly knowledgeable about their small area, and there's very little time left over for them to think broadly about society's problems, about the wicked problems. Academic science is fragmented, so the need is to try and integrate across academic boundaries to solve global problems. So how can we do that? Well, let me just tell you a little bit about how we've been trying to do this in San Francisco. So I am the director of QB3. QB3 was created not by the University of California, but by the state of California to try and boost its economic growth but to do it by integrating across boundaries where there normally had not been integration. Right? We're a networking organization meant to bring people together. QB3 arose from a competition in the state of California to create 4 institutes for science and innovation. There were 4 winners, only one of them, QB3, was in the life sciences. QB3 is a combination of Berkeley, UCSF, and UC Santa Cruz. I now, in my job, report to 3 chancellors, not just one now. But what they're meant to do is, our job then is to network the scientists across the 220 labs or so of QB3 and to try and put them together to solve the wicked problems in some way. So how does this work? Well, let me just give you 2 examples. Some years ago now, we wanted to take on the big challenge of energy, right? How could you solve that, particularly by creating biofuels? Now, to do biofuels, you have to bring so many people together, from economists, politicians, water engineers, chemical engineers, molecular biologists. One needed to cluster those groups. So my colleagues in QB3 at Berkeley did that, and then applied and won a competition with BP, British Petroleum, for which they got $50 million a year for 10 years to try and create an energy bioscience institute. That was because to try and deal with biofuels, you have to bring people together from different disciplines. I want to spend a little more time, though, on a more recent example which has gone on, and that is we're trying to look at the problem of aging within QB3 and look at it from the point of view, can we bring together the people that will create rejuvenation therapies? So, excuse me for the next few minutes. I'm basically a professor, and it's very hard for me to give a talk without including just a little science. So please forgive me. It'll be very simple and quite painless, I assure you. So why are we interested in age-related diseases? Well, if you look at the incidence of diseases as we get older, by the time we're in our 80s, 50% of us will have arthritis, about 30% heart disease, 20% cancer, and they all go up very dramatically with aging. If we could slow down the process of aging by 5 to 10 years, would slow down the incidence of all the major diseases. 95% of the cost of Western healthcare is taken up by age-related diseases, treating age-related diseases. So a revolutionary, transformative technology would be to come up with a rejuvenation therapy. So we put together a consortium of about 36 faculty from the 3 campuses from widely different areas. Let me just tell you 3 of the things that I think are most pertinent to this group. These 3 young scientists are working on a problem called parabiosis. Now, what this means, if you look at a young mouse, you can see its muscle and it's very clever, its muscle is good, its liver works well, and so on. You take an old mouse, and it's really quite senile, just like us. However, if you join the blood supplies of the young mouse and the old mouse, something quite remarkable happens. You rejuvenate the muscle, the liver, and the brain of the old mouse. There's something in the blood of the young mouse that rejuvenates these tissues. We know the mechanism. We know that it's actually making stem cells, for example, in the hippocampus, reacquire regenerative capacity. And we are now trying to get drugs, identify things in the blood of the young animals that will give rejuvenation. Another example. It's known that when you get old, you get lots of these so-called senescent cells all through your body. They're just cells which stop dividing. In this experiment, you knock out senescent cells and you slow down the aging process, right? So what you found in this mouse in the bottom, it's got a hump on its back. You look at the one above, you've taken out the senescent cells and it no longer gets old. You don't get cataract formation. The muscles are much better if you take out the senescent cells. So we've got another group of people trying to see if we can get drugs that kill senescent cells in the body in order to create rejuvenation. One last example, then I'll stop doing science. One of the big secrets that we in the medical profession prefer not to tell our patients is that when you go in and get serious surgery, major surgery, there's a very significant probability of cognitive loss. Your brain gets damaged. So, for example, hip or knee replacement, the probability of cognitive loss is 30%. If you go for heart surgery, open heart surgery, it's 80% chance of cognitive loss. Most doctors won't tell you that for obvious reasons. Mervyn Mays at UCSF has shown, looking at post-operative cognitive decline, that this involves hippocampus, but he set up an experimental model where he does a surgery on a rat. This has nothing to do with anesthesia, by the way, in case you were thinking that. You do surgery on the rat. What this does is induce an immune response, which is almost exactly like aging. You see cognitive loss again because damage in the hippocampus. So now we're trying to get drugs that prevent post-operative cognitive disorder. So in this way then, we're trying to put together a consortium view from our 33 faculties about what really might be involved in aging, and we've got a program set up so that, within hope, we might have, going into humans within 5 years, some rejuvenation therapies. This is a really big deal, right? And it's very pertinent to describe in this audience because for Korea, for Japan, for China, the problem of an aging population is a huge economic as well as social burden. So finding rejuvenation therapies is a really holy grail of molecular biologists at this moment. So the first part of my talk then has been about trying to how QB3 can act to solve grand challenges or wicked problems by bringing together people who really don't interact with each other very often. The second thing that I was asked to talk about here is how we can get this science, this fantastic science, out of the lab and trying to help society. So in order to help society, though, there's absolutely no way you can do that without working with the private sector, right? Universities don't make products, they don't provide services. We have to work with the private sector to do that. Now, basically, there are two ways the private sector solves problems. There are large companies, and there's creation of new companies. What QB3's InnoLab, that's the portion of QB3 which is involved in economic growth, what it tries to do is connect the research in our 3 universities to both large businesses and to startups. Let me first describe a little bit about what we're doing with large companies. Now, most of you who know about the pharmacological industry right now knows that it's in pretty bad troubles, right? The Pfizer, Merck just laid off 80,000 people. Most of the larger industries in the world and big pharma are not doing well. That's why they're coming to the universities to ask for help. It's very simple. If you look at the drugs which are going into first trials in man, 9 out of 10 of them are failing. Can you imagine if you designed airplanes and 9 out of 10 of them crashed on takeoff? You would think, we really don't understand aerodynamic theory. Well, we're now realizing in the pharmaceutical industry, we really don't understand drugs. And we have to go back and we're trying to apply systems biology, systems pharmacology to solve the problems. So we've been working a lot with Pfizer and mainly with other companies. We have about a $20 million partnership with Pfizer in these areas. And what we've learned working with Pfizer is that we need to change the way we think about things altogether and try to think about them in real partnerships where we take Pfizer scientists, match them up to QB3 scientists in areas where there's overlapping interest. But let me say, this turns out to be only about a small part of what QB3 does. The problem is, actually, universities and big companies don't actually go together too well. You know, most of the big pharma companies are really involved with marketing and production and manufacturing and, you know, the global policies and so on. Whereas we're down in the trenches trying to discover new targets of drugs. For the pharma companies, the drugs they're working on are 15 years old, right? The science is was done 15 years ago. So there's not a very reasonable way in the life sciences industry for us to work well with the big pharma companies. In contrast, where the real sweet spot, I would argue, for all universities is to try and do startup companies. And that's where we put 80% of our InnoLab efforts. The advantage is obvious, right? What big companies want are incremental innovations. What universities are really good at are disruptive innovations, things which change the whole paradigm. Disruptive innovations, almost by definition, are better put into startup companies than they are into established companies. So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about what we've learned a little bit about trying to help our students start startup companies. So we've set up a set of tools for them. The first one is Startup in a Box. So let me tell you what doesn't work very well. A lot of universities teach entrepreneurial courses, so you go and take classes and you get case studies about lots of companies. It's very nice, it pays faculty salaries, and I'm all in favor of that. However, when people come and want to start a company, they don't want to wait 6 months, 9 months till there's a course on intellectual property or freedom to operate agreements. They want it now, right? So what we discovered, if we want to help our students, classes don't work. We actually have to offer hands-on services. So everyone who comes in the door is our client, and we teach him or her how to start a company, how to incorporate, how to divide up their equity and so on. And we do that because we've managed to make the legal companies in the Bay Area offer free or deferred payment services to all of our students to try and make that happen. It's actually, I have to say, been remarkably successful. We expected we would maybe get about 15 students starting companies per year. For the last 2 years, we've had 140 companies incorporated. Clearly, there's a huge demand among our students to start their own company. If you make it easy for them, you can accelerate the rate of company formation quite dramatically. So someone's got their idea for a company. Oh, we also help them identify a market for their products as well through mentorship. Now they've got their company idea and they want to start working on it. Well, we're in the life sciences space. You can't do this in your bedroom or your garage. You've got to have some benches to work on. Unfortunately, fortunately, molecular biology, you need bench space. So what would happen is people would go and try and to go to real estate and say, I need to get some lab places. But real estate agents only rent out 1,000, 2,000, 2,000 square feet of space because it's not worth them doing due diligence on very small space. We said, we're not real estate agents. We'll rent you out one bench. We'll rent you out 200 square feet of space. We don't care, right? We know you're students. We trust you. So we took a little bit of space and tried to let students work in a tiny amount of space where the rents were very low, well, not they weren't subsidized, but they were very low, and they're really close to the university, so they could use walking distance, so they could use all of the university facilities. That turned out to be remarkably successful. We based the idea on the Hewlett-Packard garage, on the Google garage, in the Bay Area garages are very famous, and we called this the QB3 garage. Very, very quickly filled up. But the idea was to make it really inexpensive space so that any student with a credit card and a good idea could get their company started.
5 minutes.
Again, this was a way more successful than ever we would have guessed. We've been doing this 6 years now. We have had 15 graduated from our space. There's 62 companies currently there. We've created 400 jobs. And each one, last year, we did a summary, we brought $150 million into the Bay Area community through investment funding and small business grants. The demand was, we used up, we borrowed odd corners of space to try and do this. There wasn't enough, so we went out and found an old warehouse, broken down, unused, about a couple of blocks from our university. My colleague and I raised $4 million to do tenant improvements. And just last week, the mayor of San Francisco opened up our next what we prefer to call innovator workspace. The idea of incubators is a too messy a term. So this is innovator workspace. So we opened up last week, and we already have 22 companies signed up to move in, which will make us 2/3 full. So if you make it easy for students and give them space, they can start companies at a great speed. Now, one of the things we had to think about how we can actually fund these things. So we actually have got several mechanisms. One of them, we created our own venture fund. So I'm a managing partner of a venture fund, but I get no payment for doing that. But we can therefore raise 11 million so we can invest in all these small companies. And we take equity so that perhaps we can then help to support the poorer students by using equity return from the successful companies. We succeed in that because we have an incredibly good venture capitalists advising us. That's again an advantage of being in the Bay Area. Lots of pro bono help from talented people. We also found that the big companies wanted to come and be co-investors with us. Because we'd done all of the due diligence on these companies. We'd chosen, we're looking at about 50, 60 a year. We're choosing the top 4. Those are valuable. Other people want to invest in our top choices. So we have J&J and Novartis, and now Takeda is going to come in and invest in us. We're actually looking to see if we might get a co-investment from Khazanah, which is the sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia. But so far, no one from Korea has shown any interest in co-investing with us. So let me end by saying what we found here. What we are in a part of where I work now is the Mission Bay Area, San Francisco. This was a really broken down, decrepit part of San Francisco, very near downtown. It used to be old railroad yards, part of the port disappeared, the trains disappeared. It was a dump full of homeless. So we got space for the university in the middle of that. And what happened, we started the P-3 garage, but very quickly this has grown to our innovation workspace with 62 companies. But to our surprise, we then found that the major companies wanted to come to Mission Bay not only because of the great academic science, because they could get first-hand look at the companies in our small companies in our innovation workspace. When that happened, that attracted venture capitalists. With that all coming then, it turned out service providers wanted to move in to provide services for the companies in our workspace. Governments got very interested because they want to, other places around the world are trying to remodel decrepit, economically depressed parts of their community, and we've managed to do that. And we have several interests from some foreign countries. Most particularly, we have it from Malaysia now. We have a very good relationship with the Malaysian government here. So let me end by putting up this figure here, which is a sort of some done by Deloitte. Deloitte did some studies on us to see how we were doing it, and they come up with this very formal business school-like description of what we do. I put it up there to say that this is nothing like the way this happened. This happened by us trying things, found out what worked, what didn't work, and you can put it all together like this at the end, but this is not the way we thought about it to begin. Right? The way to do is just jump in, try experiments, and see what works, the way every scientist does things. So my conclusions then are, I promise to talk about two things: how we could do knowledge integration, that academia works best at solving society problems if it has ways, concrete ways of trying to connect across disciplinary boundaries. And the second thing, one of the best ways you can start the economy is to have a low-cost, inexpensive, university-associated startup community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And the last speaker in this session is Professor Gerhard Schmidt from ETH Zurich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here, and I'm quite impressed by what I heard and also intimidated completely by all the successes. I'm speaking from another place on the earth, from Switzerland. I'm not Swiss, so I can say certain good things about this country. And I got my education partially at these institutions that you were mentioning before. In Switzerland, long time before the Second World War, there was an institution founded, ETH Zurich, which had the clear objective to industrialize, to help the industrialization of the country. In 1855, right after Switzerland came out of a series of internal wars, revolutions, and so on. And it founded this ETH Zurich, and it was really a polytechnicum, as it was called, with engineering sciences, of course, but very strong natural science and mathematics, with system-oriented natural sciences, which came later, and management and social sciences, which were there from the beginning. But from the very beginning, it's a specialty that architecture and civil engineering and building sciences were very strongly established. As a matter of fact, those were the first departments at ETH, because that was needed to build up the country. The outline of the talk is the context, the global competitiveness, of course, then the general strategy, the global strategy, and the innovation and creativity as it pertains to the area of Zurich and to the area, of course, of whole Switzerland. And Switzerland is a very specific country. It is at the moment the #1 in competitiveness and innovation. And it is also the #1 in the number of cities who are in the top 10 worldwide for livability. So the quality of life, livability, competitiveness, and innovation are concentrated in this country. Surprising, because no natural resources, as we hear from many small countries, very mountainous like Korea, and also surrounded not by enemies, but not always very friendly neighbors with whom we do business very well. And also in the top country brands, in spite of being successful, it is also very highly ranked. As a matter of fact, it's #1 in the top country brands last year and this year. How is this possible? And let's have a look at a few specifics. As I said, the population, this morning we heard Israel, Switzerland, almost the same population. Singapore with 5.3 million, planning to be in the region of 7 million in the next years, coming in the same number of population. So this seems to be an interesting number for small countries who are quite successful. The surface, small, 41,000 square kilometers, and more than half of it mountains, famous mountains, very divided into many, many cantons. And this is strange because if you look at Seoul here, the city itself is about, depending how you calculate it, 3 to 4 times the population of the entire Switzerland. Different languages, very competing languages, and one language that is not officially listed here, but that everybody speaks, which is English. Very early on, after the main societal and main industrial problems for Switzerland were solved before the First World War and the Second World War, it became clear that we have to orient our view to other problems. And since quite a while, it is now the need for scientific contributions to a sustainable world which are at the center of our attention. So there's a long-term preview in how we think the world could be or will be very much in 2050. And we know we don't have so many people to actually steer this development, but we have ideas and techniques and technologies that we can influence this development. And at the top of the list, of course, are the improvement of access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities to satisfy the aspirations of a growing middle class, to raise agricultural productivity, to increase efficiency and reduce waste in the use of all natural resources, including water, and managing ecosystems and biodiversity, and halving and reducing CO2 emissions even further. These are all things we have to do in Switzerland already, and we think we have to do it worldwide. ETH Zurich strategy, because it is a federal university that together with the ETH in Lausanne, the EPFL, is the only federal university, the federal system of universities and research systems in Switzerland, has these ideas also on its strategies. So addressing societal problems in technology and policy, how to react to the decision of Parliament and the population to shut down all nuclear power plants, which at the moment provide 40% of our electricity, and to find alternatives to that in a relatively short time, to make new policies, framework to prepare for peak phosphorus, for extreme droughts worldwide and its repercussions on Switzerland, to make regulatory frameworks for geological carbon sequestration, urban noise reduction, seemingly very unrelated tasks, but very much related when you come down to the science level, to have a very clear performance measure and performance assessment of regulations in different areas, to understand consumers' choices much better than in the past, to monitor and data needs for controlling GMOs and air pollutants, and risk assessment procedures for nanomaterials, energy-saving lights, and other new products, and to provide design toolboxes for sustainable cities, and make resilient systems under climate change, and closing the nutrient cycle. So these are big themes that we are working on, always under the knowledge that the scientists are able to find solutions to individual parts of these problems, and then as a university and a society, we can combine them and make larger units out of it that can actually solve these problems in other places. One of the secrets of that is not a secret. This is what I experienced when I studied in Berkeley many, many years ago. I was surprised to have almost no American students in these master classes and almost no American professors teaching me. This is a very global phenomenon, and ETH is a very global university in this sense, that from the very beginning it was extremely internationally and global. Here you see the total numbers. I don't know if you can read them from the back. It's a relatively small place, 17,000 students. half graduate, half undergraduate. And the number of, or the percentage of foreign students is very high. As a matter of fact, ETH Zurich and the ETH Lausanne together are the most internationalized universities worldwide. The graph here also shows that it has changed over time. On the very left, you see the number or the percentage of foreign professors when the ETH was founded in 1855. These professors came mainly, in this case, from Germany, from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which doesn't exist anymore, from Russia, from Norway, and that was also represented in the student population. Then it went down, the percentage of foreign professors, to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and then it started to rise again. So now we're back at the same level as it was in 1855. So this is not an eternal fact, but it's going up and down over time. There are two very different extreme examples where we think we can make a big contribution to the country's development and to the region's development, of course. Big data is obvious, it's in everybody's mind these days, but in terms of ownership, systems development, in terms of security, provenance, quantity, quantifying uncertainty, and visual analytics, we can make big contributions with very little impact on natural or need for natural resources or laboratories. And the examples then in business are very manifold, and many of the spin-offs go in this area, of course, in targeted advertisement or e-health or big learning as just three examples. And in science, there are more than enough examples to be used that can use big data in high energy physics or in pharma or in sociology. And on the other side of the scale is the engineering. You might not know that Switzerland is the country with the highest per capita output in engineering products per person in the world. And we see that very clearly in the demand of students to take engineering fields at ETH. So you can see the growth between 2000 and today of more than 50%, 60% the overall student population, but more than 60% in engineering, actually 75% in engineering. To make this knowledge available not only to Switzerland because it is too small a market, we need to expand worldwide and to bring this knowledge, export this knowledge worldwide, hoping and building on the fact that the people we export are coming back, or the products that we export are coming back in terms of knowledge and finances. So our main goal for the universities are to educate future leaders and experts, of course, to address challenging and complex research topics, and to position ETH Zurich as a forward-looking global research university. It was mentioned very nicely at the beginning, what is a research university, a global research university, what can it do? And this is exactly our goal. To this end, because the faculty is so international, there's more than 6,000 research contacts and contracts with places all over the world. You can see the map here. It's dotted everywhere, with many of them in Asia, many of them in Japan, China, Korea, of course, also densely populated in this map here. And these are the individual professors doing research with other professors in the other countries and institutions. And this is reflected in the students' internationalization. Also here you have the same picture like with the professors. In 1855 on the very left scale, then 1856, almost 70% of the student body were international at ETH. There were an extreme number of students from other countries, and today, only today, it's reaching the same numbers again. So the internationalization of the professors, of the students, is something which is very important. And it's important for the forward-looking treaties and memorandums of understanding and missions we have with other countries, which we see here, bilateral agreements with research universities, with research organizations in this country and in other countries. And it is also important, as I mentioned, for the individual research contacts, which are still mainly focused in Europe, but spreading out worldwide. The final point, and this is, we think, very important for this conference here, is the innovation and creativity. We know that you cannot just sprinkle creative centers into a city or into a university. They really have to grow from the inside out. And not only in the university, but also in the city and in the country. I don't know if many of you know that in Zurich, for example, which is normally seen as a city for banking, more people are in creative industry than in banking. And they are contributing more than 5% of the GDP of Zurich, for example, already. In ETH, of course, there's again a lot of creative fields that we try to bring to market. And these are all fields, as you will see, which have very little need for big resources in terms of mechanics or materials and so on. So it is, of course, in computer vision, everything that's related to that, to being more inventive with face-driven avatars to recognize objects, scenes, and so on. And these are actually starting to turn into real projects. You might know that Disney has its only research lab outside of the US in Zurich at ETH, so this is a very strong collaboration here. Then also nanosciences, of course, are very, very important. You can see a professor from this country working very hard on this field, and collaborations, direct collaborations with industry, with IBM and others in building common labs to explore these applications and research. Then to try to focus on the process of bringing something from invention to market, building a chain implementation along a value chain from capacity building to accelerating research and innovation, to promote entrepreneurship and talents, to interact with the Partnership Council, which we founded for that, and then supplying industry. This is a process that is fairly established and constantly questioned and made new. For this, we founded the so-called IE Lab, Innovation Entrepreneurship Lab, which is bearing fruits now very quickly, and you can see some of the companies that came out of it at the bottom, which support it. In the last 96 until today, there are more than 260 spin-offs coming out of ETH. As a matter of fact, at the moment, or since the last years, it's at the rate of 2 per month coming out. And the specialty is that they stay over a longer period of time, which is not like the model we find in other places. That means after 5-6 years, more than 80% are still in business. Many of them are doing quite well. So for example, the Sensirion now, which has a very high increase in sales to more than 80 million last year, and 50% increase in staff. They then get bought by big pharma quite often. This happens as well.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. We bring out a large number of PhDs and masters into industry within every year. The numbers at the bottom, like more than 700 PhDs and 1,600 masters in 2 years, 900 new contracts, 80 new patents, and so on. So it's a lot of activity in this field, which we think is extremely important. I want to end with one specific field of innovation, not happening in Zurich, but in Singapore, because we decided about 4 years ago that many of the techniques and the knowledge that we work on in Switzerland is very valuable, but we cannot apply it in Switzerland or in any place in the Northern Hemisphere, because the population there, for example, is not growing, but shrinking or staying the same. So the whole question of the cities has been at our mind for a long time. And we know that in the next 25 years, more than 2 billion people will either have to move into cities or will be born in cities and need new working and living space in those cities. So this is a phenomenon that is not happening in the north, maybe with very few exceptions. Seoul, of course, being a very, very fast growing city, but most of the others are not in this situation. But in the tropics and in the long or the broad band around the equator, this is happening. And it's the biggest challenge and will be the biggest business, if you want, for the next 50 to 60 years to build and make all these amendments to the existing and the new cities. As a matter of fact, more building structures have to be built in the next 40 years than have been built in the last 4,000 years. So this is really an area, if we don't do this right, we will have the next and the next catastrophe in terms of transportation, poverty, and so on. So we've tried to export many of the findings from Switzerland we have, that means the absolute reliance on equality, on direct democracy, the fact that we cannot do these things with extractive systems, as they are called, the many findings that we have from science, of course, from engineering, that has to be transformed into the tropical situation and different geological situation. And we cannot do that in the north. We have to do that where the situation is really happening. That's a reason to do that in Singapore. And again, it's one of the creative industry departments, if you want, at ETH, the architecture, who brought together a big team from their own faculty, but also from all the other faculty. The example that was given before from San Diego fits very well. You cannot do that with simple specified departments. You have to bring together all these faculty to attack this problem of the future city, to understand what a city is in the first place, which is surprising. Nobody really understands how a city works. We have many, many specialists, but very few who understand the system of the city, how to improve it, how to run it, how to manage it better, and how to make it more sustainable for the future. So for this, we founded this laboratory in Singapore together with the Natural Research Foundation of Singapore. And we started 3 years ago with 2 people, and we have now more than 200 researchers involved in that, in Zurich, in Singapore mainly, and in 22 cities around the world. We are now thinking of starting a second program in future resilient systems, because cities and resilient systems are very much related. This is where all the insurance and reinsurance industry comes in from Switzerland, very strong reinsurance industry. And so suddenly we find new potential collaborations between industry and university from areas that were not expected before, but which are possible now that we have successful applications of the city program in other countries. This, of course, has to go into education and into further programs that we start. So with this, I try to give you a brief overview of the projects that we think are necessary to make the acceleration of research, the integration with industry, and that it is always a local, a context-based business. I think this is important too, and that equality, low Gini coefficient in the places that we do these things are important to make it a success in the long term. Thank you very much. With a picture from Switzerland, from the Monte Rosa hut, where we have built the first building, an autonomous building in the Alps at 3,000 meters height, to put in all the innovations that we have made in research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our speakers kept a very good time, so we do have ample time to have a discussion with the audience on the floor. Do you have any questions? It would be nice if you can identify yourself and also identify the person you're asking to.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm a director of International Student Organization for Sustainable Development and the Green Campus. My question is about the relation between the sustainable development and the opportunity for young people. Many young people think that sustainable development implies not the extension, but contraction of economy and job and society. Because we must cut consumption, we must reduce resources. But I think sustainable development can, of course, supply many new opportunities in very different areas. How do you think about this question, especially Professor Kelly and Gerhard Schmidt and to Kosler? Thank you very much.
Whom do you want to start? Okay.
Let me start because, in case you didn't know, UC San Diego is one of the most sustainable campuses in the country, actually. We generate more than 90% of our electricity We have solar panels on just about every building top, every garage. We have more than 25 student organizations that are focused on sustainable development and sustainable living. I think your question is a good one. I think it is indeed possible to have a sustainable lifestyle without giving up your quality of life or without giving up luxury. I think the problem we face right now, so let's just take solar panels for example. If you take away the government subsidies in solar panels are not going to compete with coal-fired power plants and the power they generate. They're not going to compete with nuclear power. So I think we need to spend some time, some money in keeping these subsidies, but after some number of years, we need to take them away. Let me just make one more point. Spain had a lot of subsidies in wind power, and right now they're taking them all away, and turns out the wind power industry in Spain is going this way, going south.
I think when we think about sustainable economy, I think I have just tremendous optimism about young people in the world and how they're changing it. And let me just give two examples of things which are leading to sustainability. One, those of you who heard Laszlo Bock this morning heard about the self-drive cars. You may not have heard that Google just bought a taxi service in San Francisco where you can call up on your cell phone and get a taxi to come. And of course, the concept there is actually very transformative. In the time to come, none of us will have cars, right? There will only be cars available, which we can then call up with our machines. They will drive independently to us. We'll get in them, tell you where we want to go. So we won't all have our own cars, right? So talking about transforming cities, can you imagine if we didn't all have our own cars? That's a very big transformative thing, which is emerging now. Another thing which came out of just our graduate students, again, they're incredible creatively, is they tried to decide, can you actually take an industry like textile industry, which uses huge amounts of water, agricultural land, and growing cotton, silk, and mulberry farms, and so on. So what they did was take the genes for the silk genes, and put them into a bacterium which has a secretory apparatus, and they've learned now it secretes the silk, and they've learned to spin it up to about a centimeter or so long. Very, very early, but can you imagine how transformative this would be if all textile production all over the world was made in fermenters and didn't require fields of cotton or fields of mulberry trees? It could make it, so these sort of transformative, economically transformative things are all happening, and I think we can be grateful it's happening out of our very brilliant young people who think ways that we never would have thought.
Professor Schmidt?
I agree. There is no reason to think that sustainability means just saving and reducing and doing all kinds of terrible things to your previous life. Because there's really an abundance, as we know, of energy in the first place, just a matter how we transform it. And as soon as the sustainable lifestyle or sustainable development becomes a part of the lifestyle, I think then it works quite well. Then we don't even have to think about how to run cars automatically or with alternative drives. Maybe you don't run cars at all, because the young people are voting by their feet or by their wheels. In many European countries, in many European cities, especially in Zurich, you can see the number of driver's licenses for young people is going down drastically. Something that used to be the #1 must-have a few years ago, a car, suddenly has dropped out of the priority list. They spend their money or whatever resources they have on different items, which are all less energy intensive or pollution intensive. So I think there's the young people are much smarter than we in many aspects. So I'm not worried about this. But we have to make sure that the products that we develop go in this direction and not try to somehow save these dinosaurs from the past.
Hello, professors and all great scholars. My name is Yena Kim, and I'm a graduate student studying at KDI School of Public Policy and Management, studying public policy. And thank you for all of your presentation. And I have two questions to ask you. First, all of your concepts and all of your great presentations seem to be more focused on situations with the countries with good human resources and good conditions like US or Switzerland or maybe Korea. But what would you advise if any developing countries like Africa or East Asia try to adopt or try to implement this kind of good theories or good knowledges into their situation to solve their poverty or economic growth? And secondly, Professor Kosla, you mentioned something about creation of knowledge and transition of knowledge. And I believe that all of these technologies and can solve some social issues. And you've mentioned social issues like aging or poverty. But there are some disconnection between knowledge and transition, actually, while implementing those into policy. So what kind of advice and what do you have as a scientist who develop technologies and innovations to solve these social issues, really? Thank you.
I can start again. So before I went to UC San Diego about 1 year and 4 months ago, before I went to UC San Diego, I was at Carnegie Mellon for 30 years. One of the things that I'm the most proud of while I was at Carnegie Mellon, Dean of Engineering, was building a campus in Rwanda, in Kigali, Rwanda. And the reason I did that is because I honestly believe that the US structure of graduate education is the best in the world in terms of the way we teach, in terms of the way we do research, in terms of the way we connect research to economic development, to government policies, government investment. And the only reason I did this in Rwanda was because I was working very closely with the president, and they wanted to build a system that was just like the US. So I'm actually very bullish. I think these developing countries may not have the sophisticated human resources like the US does, but it has as hungry a population as the US does in terms of wanting to achieve something. And with the right type of government policy, right investment, and the right educational infrastructure, I think you can replicate the success of US, which is, in my mind, unprecedented.
So we're working with the Philippines and Malaysia right now, and we're just working out the ideas. Whether they'll work eventually, I don't know. But one of the things that we're thinking of, say, taking Malaysia, it's going to be very hard for them to create the sort of ecosystem that we have with venture capital suppliers and so on in the short term. It's going to take 10 years or so. In the meantime, for both the Philippines and Malaysia, there should be nothing wrong with them sending their entrepreneurs over to be trained with us, right, in our things, and then going back to those countries. Countries are very happy to send their students off to universities to learn and then come back. It seems they should just broaden their thinking a little bit to send their entrepreneurs off and to learn to take their company from 0 to 30 miles an hour, get to the stage where they're sort of ready to expand, get Series A funding, move up to 10 or 50, then bring them back to their country. So I think there's ways that you could actually make use of the ecosystems that exist until other countries build up their own.
Professor Schmidt, do you have a brief comment?
Yes. I think this is a very good question, of course, because that is concerning the majority of the world's population. It's more than 80% who are faced with this problem. And so specifically, we don't mention this, but as it turns out, all of us are somehow dealing with that. Switzerland, ETH in particular, being Switzerland a neutral country, has, of course, a special relation to these other countries which are in stress quite often, being a negotiator between the superpowers, the old superpowers. But in particular, ETH is very heavily involved in Africa, in specific countries, sub-Sahara countries in Africa. And we find again that the whole question of urbanization, or to find a balance between the urban and the rural, is really a key point. This is what makes Switzerland successful as a country. There's not big centers that dominate everything, but it's this balance between the countryside and the city that makes it strong. So we not only try, but we have actually built building cities now in Ethiopia according to this principle, and it seems to work quite well. Also in Nigeria, in Jakarta. We're looking at very many neighborhoods in Jakarta itself, in Indonesia, and then of course in Myanmar and Yangon. So you can go to almost any place in these countries and you find experts from Swiss universities bringing in what they can. But the key point is, of course, as we heard this morning in the keynote speech, you cannot just transport, you cannot just copy things there. So you have to have a process of transformation in those countries, in these other contexts, for a few years before it's working. But then I think it can work very, very well. Every time we try it, it works quite well.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Yuzin Pai. I'm a graduate of Indiana University in Bloomington. I have a question for Professor Regis Kelly. In the P-3 project, you bring together very smart and talented people as a team. And my question here is that how do you make them work together as a team? Is it the culture that you've created, or do you provide any financial or non-financial incentives to make them together as a team, or to improve them, improve their team performances?
Those are very good questions. One of the things that was essential, I've been doing this about 12 years now, was changing the culture. Particularly in the life sciences, there's been a feeling, people actually used to write books about this, about how evil it was for the universities to get involved with the big pharma companies that were selling out and losing their soul. I think that was foolish, right? You shouldn't let yourself be dominated by big pharma. We could bring our ethical standards to pharma, right, rather than the other way around. So I think one has to keep one's sense of responsibility and work with the big pharma. But we also had to change the culture in the university. And it was very important, actually. One of the reasons that started my whole change was talking to the graduate students. And they said, look, we're being trained to be really good academics, but half of us are not going to get jobs in academics, and we're going to go into industry, but you provide no training and no preparation for that. So we had to make it so that when I was in the Chancellor's office, it was the Chancellor's office that was starting these things. So it was coming from very high up, the approval of going into companies. Now, when it comes down to financing things, it's actually a complicated issue. When we looked at other incubators around the world, around America mainly, and see most of them actually were disasters. And you had to look, when we looked at why they didn't work, is most of them were subsidized by the local governments, and they were very, very cheap, right? And so people, once they got in, it was very hard to move them out. And so most of them become geriatric wards very quickly, with old companies you couldn't get rid of. So we thought we wouldn't go into subsidizing things. Instead, we would keep standard rents, but very small amounts of space. If you want to grow, you bring in more money. And we would charge standard amounts of rent for this. And that turns out to be really important. When you're trying to get someone to be entrepreneurial, this thing that really I would say is the most important characteristic is passion. There has to be fire in their belly, right? And so if someone comes up with an idea but isn't gone out and gone to the usual 3 Fs of friends, families, and fools and tried to get some money to start their company, then they haven't got the skills that are going to be necessary to them succeed in the startup world. So we actually use the capacity to them to raise the very small amounts of rent, about $1,000 a month, which you in some ways could do on your credit card. If you aren't ready to do that, you probably shouldn't be thinking of getting into the business world at all. So that's the way we've looked at it.
More questions? Yeah, there's one. Oh, there's one
All right,
from back.
They're going to do it for me. Just a quick question which has to do with cities. The way I'm listening to you talking, building a new campus in Rwanda, on what is unquestionably an available piece of land that was comparatively empty. Same thing in Ethiopia with cities. What if you walked into existing cities in terms of regions? Are you suggesting that the way to sustainability is building new cities and moving people out of old ones, and then taking abandoned old cities and redoing them? And then who participates in all of this? I think the question over here was, what does this do for students? Which students are in there? Are they from developing countries? Are they from the countries that are affected? And, you know, how do you think about cities in the ways in which city planners such as Kevin Lynch have thought about them? And that was 50 years ago, looking with cities that were in states of destruction. And this is very different the way I'm listening to you talk. Are you talking about moving populations into new places and abandoning old ones? Let's stick with that one. And who's involved in all of that?
Yeah, I don't think the idea is to abandon old cities and move into new ones. In Ethiopia, for example, it's just the population is growing so fast, by 5-6% per year, that the main idea is to keep the people where they are in the countryside and to densify nuclei which are already there and build emerging cities there, that they don't have to go into the capital and end up in slums for the first years. So that's the only reason. And worldwide, probably it's 80-20 rule again, that 80% of the investment, of the transformation of cities is in existing cities, but even existing cities need to be rebuilt. And the problem is that we cannot use the recipes from the north in those emerging countries, and we should not. This is some big mistake we made over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and we have to stop that. That means in the tropics, in these whole tropical regions, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South America, we have to educate, we have to work with local experts to find a way to make those cities more sustainable. We cannot go to these places coming from cities that have a per person consumption footprint of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12,000 kilograms of CO2 per year and telling them to become sustainable when they at the moment have maybe 2,000 or 3,000. So this is where we really have to transform existing cities in our latitudes normally, and also build new ones and make sure that the new ones being built in the tropics will not come to the level of footprints of carbon and greenhouse gas footprints that we have in the north.
Yeah, I just want to add, just clarify, this campus in Rwanda was not as much to demonstrate sustainability as it was to demonstrate how an educational infrastructure, an institution of education can really transform and create economic development, where what the president wanted to do was create and was to move from an economy that was basically agricultural to one that was knowledge-based. And the only way to do that, in my mind, was to have a center of mass somewhere, and that center of mass had to be, had to be an institution of higher education, and then around that we would create economic development. And it was done right inside Kigali. It was not done in a barren land where there is no city around. Kigali is the capital, so.
And just to make one comment on that, more in sort of urban development within the West. I mean, besides looking at poor countries outside America, we can look at very poor, depressed areas within the country. And one of the very nice things about trying to do startups and get these things going, people, they're running on a shoestring, and so they need to go to places which are really cheap, right? And so what we found in the Bay Area is that biotech companies first going to South San Francisco, then going to Emeryville at the very early stages when the money was really very important to them. Then they were successful and grew and have transformed both of those cities because they've created jobs. So I think the idea of using startups as a way of energizing economically depressed areas is a good one.
Okay, there was a question. Yeah. This will be the last question.
Thank you for your speech. I'm the college student of College of the Pharmacy. I'm Han Jung Chan, and I have question to the Kelly, Liz Kelly, and how many undergrad students participate in the project, and because I think in the university, many people say the undergrad student is not enough to participate in real research. So I was impressed and curious about the ratio about undergrad student in the project.
I have to say that probably, actually about within our companies, within the university, it's about half and half postdocs and graduate students starting companies. But now if you take, say, the 60 we have currently in our incubator, one of the things which I didn't mention because of time, was in fact only about 30 of the companies that we have in there actually come from the university. What we found, and we didn't expect this again, was that we're getting a lot of companies coming from churn in the biotech industry. As you probably realize, a company when it's growing maybe has 3 products, 3 ideas or 4 ideas it's trying to bring to market. And then when one of them is successful, they need to put all of the resources in that one to get it through clinical trials. So they then close down the other 3 projects. And so those things which have very good science, right? The people who were, but they had to be closed down for economic reasons. Those people really like their companies. And so they come to us and see, can they actually do a startup on the idea that got rejected by the company? So we're about 50-50, what we call churn from the pharmaceutical, from startups, from biotech companies and students. There's a big advantage to that actually, because the people coming back from companies into our incubator space, our innovation network, they actually bring expertise of the companies with them. So it makes it a more interactive group. And when Deloitte did a study of why our particular innovation network was successful, almost the first thing all of the people there said, it was a sense of community. It wasn't that Reg Kelly runs it or we're near UCSF or anything like that. They always said that they really, really get most out of the community by their fellow community members. So having the mixture of people who have been in industry with students turned out to be quite successful.
Okay, we have heard in this session the fascinating examples of how the universities become the driver for economic growth as well as solving social problems. I thank all the speakers, and please join me thanking them again.
감사합니다.